that is affiliated with IMO. And so what we've been doing is through AmeriGeo, they have this data platform, and users in the Caribbean had expressed that they were interested in having some functionality that's similar to the NOAA IRMA platforms, emergency response management application, which some of our experts will be presenting. And they are at AmeriGeo going to set up an information toolkit related to different topical areas, and oil spills would be one of them. Brazil is a member country of AmeriGeo, and while this effort has been focused on the Caribbean for a starting point, there is an opportunity to do this in other areas of the Americas, so throughout Brazil. So that's an option. And one thing I'll notice is that the data that is shared with AmeriGeo is taken from openly shared government data. So whatever is shared within Brazil can be pulled into the AmeriGeo platform and visualized with different information. And so there's not a requirement that you'd have to register your information in several different spots. So this is something that we're working on with AmeriGeo now. And then regarding capacity development, the NOAA Satellite Analysis Branch is working with some colleagues in Trinidad and Tobago that are based at the Institute of Marine Affairs, Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries, and Environmental Management Authority. And the NOAA Satellite Analysis Branch is training about 18 people in Trinidad to be able to look at satellite data and detect possible oil spills. And we will have some experts from the NOAA Satellite Analysis Branch as part of the breakout discussion. And we are talking to Trinidad about what geographic scope they're going to cover. So that's an ongoing conversation. But really excited about linking up with local stakeholders to have them trained to do the analysis themselves. And if there are any questions, this is my contact information, and we're happy to discuss with you further. We're a voluntary international network, and are happy to work with various stakeholders moving forward. So thank you, and we really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Emily. I thought this provided a nice background of the work of GEO, especially focusing on AmeriGeo and the link to the IO Caribe working group, IO Oil Spill Working Group. And also, I think there was a nice segue in showing some of the capacity development and training opportunities that NOAA Satellite Analysis Branch has been providing for the region. So all good, and thank you so much. We're going to circle back around to see if Dr. Barker was able to resolve the connection issues. Are you with us, Dr. Barker?
Well, I hope so. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay, thank you.
Well, that's
Sorry
the case,
about that.
then, basically, I'll let you go ahead and do your presentation on operational modeling for oil spill response in the U.S. The floor is yours.
Okay, sorry for all the confusion before. So I want to dive into it quickly since I wasted so much time fiddling with the microphone. So I'm from what's known as NOAA's Emergency Response Division. And just a little bit about what we do. We are designated by the National Contingency Plan to provide what we call scientific support for spills of hazardous materials, including oil and coastal waters. So our central office is available 24/7, all times of day or night, to provide the support if there are spills of any sort. And our mission is to help identify, assess, prioritize, and mitigate injuries caused by these releases, and to accelerate the restoration and recovery. So this all gets summed up in that our goal is to provide credible, timely, and appropriate advice to people actually mounting the response to spills. So as part of this effort, we do quite a bit of modeling, and I want to talk a little bit about sort of why we do it the way we do. So we develop our models in-house. Most of the tools we use are developed by our staff, and we've been doing this for 30 years now. And the reason for that is that the people developing the models and the people using the models operationally are on the same team. And this means we understand the strengths and limitations of those models. If we have to, we can actually add features or fix problems with the software right in the middle of a response. And the tools are developed specifically to support response. So they're sort of well suited to the job we're trying to do. At this point, our current sort of collection of models that we call the NOAA, the General NOAA Operational Modeling Environment, or GNOME suite for oil spill modeling. At the core of this is what we call PyGNOME, which is the core sort of computational fate and oil fate and transport model. We have a web interface to that known as WebGNOME. We have a database of oil properties that has actually just recently gone operational in a new version, and we are collecting data from everywhere we can to have a comprehensive database. We have a system called GOODS, the GNOME Oceanographic Operational Data Server, which is what we use to access the data we need to try to drive these spill models. We've also developed a system for statistical analysis of contingency planning. We have a database and analysis tool for looking at oil and chemical toxicity, and a little utility for converting the units used in oil spills, which are kind of strange physical units. All of this software is open source and publicly available and can be found on our website if you're looking for more information. A little bit about how we think about response. We have what we call the 5 questions. So you have to sort of start with what happened? What is the actual event? What got spilled? Where did it get spilled? How much? All those kinds of issues. And then once we understand what we're facing, we have the core question is, where could it go? So when oil is spilled in the sea, it doesn't just stay where it gets spilled, it gets moved by the winds and currents. And we need to understand where it can go so that we can then think about what it might affect, what harm it could cause, and what can be done to help. So these are the 5 questions that we try to provide support for the responders to help understand what's going on and what can be done. The modeling efforts are primarily focused on where could it go, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. So a big piece of what we do especially in the initial couple days of response, is what we call trajectory forecasts. So this is, where is the oil going to go? And what we try to provide is what we call a trajectory analysis. So we're not just running a model and sort of handing the results off to the command, but we're using those running models, using those models to help guide our analysis so that we can sort of provide a big picture as what's expected. And we try to answer these basic questions: where the oil is going to go, how bad will it be when it gets there? Is it going to be thick, heavy, large quantities of oil washing up on the beach, or a few scattered tar balls? And how certain are we about that result? Because every time we do any kind of forecast, there's always an uncertainty, and it's very important for us to convey, yes, we think this is what's most likely to happen, but there are some probabilities that something else might happen that we should be prepared for. And fundamentally, this whole analysis is about trying to guide response decisions. So when responding to an oil spill, people need to know where to go, where to set up equipment, what kind of equipment they're going to need. And we try to provide as much guidance as we can to help support that effort. So we respond to about 150 or so spills a year. Most of those are pretty small. Our typical situation might be 10,000 gallons or less of diesel fuel from, say, a fishing boat that hits a rock or runs aground. So out of those 150 spills a year, there's only a dozen or so that really need this sort of trajectory modeling effort. When you have a sort of small spill far offshore, a model doesn't really help you. You already kind of know the sort of scale of the spill you have to deal with. Most of our responses are really only 1 or 2 days, but again, we have that maybe a dozen or probably 2 or 3 a year that can go on for, a week or multiple weeks. And importantly, our mission is to support the entire United States, which includes major navigable rivers, bays and estuaries, the coastal region, offshore. So we have a really just, huge range of spills that we need to try to respond to, and we need to be prepared to do the modeling for if necessary. That bottom link on this slide, the incidentnews.gov, is a public site that provides a sort of summary of all the events we are and have been working on. So a little note about the fact that we need to support this huge range of scales from major rivers to offshore. And to actually make a forecast about where oil is going to go, we can use an oil spill transport model, but that needs to be driven by the ocean currents, by meteorological situations. We need maps that cover that region, and all of those things need to be at the appropriate scale. So there isn't sort of just, one or two models we can go to. Depending on where we are, there's a very wide range of models we might need to access. So these include regional models for bays and estuaries, many of which are run by NOAA's operational division to help support navigation, all the way up to the global models such as HICOM, which was mentioned in the first talk this morning. So we have this system called GOODS, which again is publicly available, and it provides kind of one place to go to get access to all the various kinds of models and maps and measured data that we might use to help support our modeling. So I want to just talk a little about what the trajectory analysis process is. So when we get that first phone call, whatever time of day or night it might come in, we immediately try to assess the spatial and temporal scale of the event. So is this 1,000 gallons of diesel fuel 20 miles offshore in a stormy conditions, in which case it's going to go away and be a very short-term problem? Is this a large spill of a persistent oil somewhere near a sensitive wetland where it could be a really large, long-term process? And then within less than an hour, we try to provide an initial analysis that scales the problem and gives an idea of what people need to expect. Are they looking at a long-term response or a short-term response? How quickly do they need to get somewhere? What can they immediately do? And then if it's not just a sort of a short-term scale problem and the scale requires it, then we begin to gather data. We look for weather forecasts. We look at what available ocean circulation models there are. We gather that information, we configure and run the model. And then once we've actually run the model, we then create a product that includes our full trajectory analysis. So this includes assumptions in the scenario description, what information went into creating this model, what data we used for it. We write up an analysis of what we think the major features are, that in this situation, tidal currents are the major factor, or maybe you're out in the Gulf of Mexico near the loop current, and that's something you need to be concerned about. And then we provide some kind of maps about where the oil is likely to go, when it's likely to get there, and try to include uncertainty in that analysis. And usually part of this is also an oil fate analysis. Is this a oil, a lot of it's going to evaporate in a short period of time? Is it a long persistent oil? What are people going to expect in that case? And then if this is a longer term ongoing incident, every single day or sometimes 2 times a day, we review observations, including remote sensing observations such as satellites, as well as observations from overflights, people using helicopters or fixed wing aircraft to fly over the spill. And they report back to us what the oil looks like, where it's been going, and we can use that information to recalibrate the model, reinitialize the model, and then we go back and gather updated forecasts and data and go through this whole process once again. So the final product, and this is an example from the Deepwater Horizon, where we're producing these kinds of maps once a day for many months in this case. That's an unusually large scale problem, but it's kind of that big example. So this includes a map. It includes uncertainty bound. It includes a summary of the data sources we use to drive the model. Very importantly, what date and time this forecast was produced, so that when it becomes out of date, people will know that. The date of the forecast, some of the key briefing points, what we're expecting to happen, what those sort of first few things you want to tell the response and the command, what we can tell. And of course, the various scales on here, both spatial scale and a scale about if we have different, in this case, different colors on the map, what does that mean? What is a heavy oil in this case? What is light oil? So that's what we do for immediate response. And I just want to briefly mention a couple of other things. Our system known as TAP, the Trajectory Analysis Planner, it's a planning tool. And what we do is we run the NOAA model thousands of times based on hindcast winds and currents for a particular region. And this will then give us a sort of statistical assessment of how some potential spill in the future might behave. So this is an example from Southern California, and those X's on the maps are the oil platforms. So you might potentially have a spill from one of those platforms. And in this case, the red region doesn't mean that there's oil in that whole region. What it means is there's a high probability that if there's a release from that particular location, that the areas in red will be impacted. And then as you get into the yellows and blues, the probability of the impact goes down. So this gives you a picture. If you want to try to plan and prepare for a spill from a particular location, you can have an idea what places you're going to need to protect, how you might need to respond. Another tool I want to mention briefly, and Emily just mentioned this, is the NOAA Satellite Analysis Branch. Has the Marine Pollution Surveillance Program, and they are looking every single day at the latest satellite data and trying to identify potential oil spills in that region. And when they see something, or in the entire United States, coastal region. And when they find something that looks like it might be an oil spill, they produce these reports with a description of what they found, how likely it is to be oil, whether it's thick or thin, and where it's located. So we are constantly made aware of these, and so between NOAA and the U.S. Coast Guard, we can go and investigate these potential spills. The Satellite Analysis Branch also monitors our response link system, so every time we get a report of a spill that we're responding to, they take a look at that spill and say, is there some way we can support this with remote sensing? And if so, then they will go about potentially collecting additional imagery than what they usually use, and do what they can to support the incident. So that's what I have for the moment. And I guess we won't be taking any questions, but I'm looking forward to discussing all of these things with you tomorrow.
Thank you, Dr. Barker. Yeah, for those that do have questions, please put them in the messages or in the chat, and we'll try to get those over to Dr. Barker for his consideration. Also, you'll have an opportunity during the chat that you'll have later this week. Thank you for the presentation. I think it provided a nice overview of the Office of Response and Restoration Emergency Response Division, the scientific support that is provided to those that respond to oil spills, including the multiple models, the multiple scales. Also, I think it was very nice to see the description of the Trajectory Analysis Planner when you want to take a look at and plan for future events. So thank you very much for that. Very comprehensive. Moving on to the next session, which is or theme is biotechnology related to response and mitigation of oil spills. Our first speaker, and I apologize if I don't get the pronunciation just right, but Maria Maciel Melo from the Federal University of Ceará in Brazil. And Dr. Mello will be speaking about formulation of microbial consortia for the bioremediation of heavy oil contamination. And the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning to you all. I'm going to share my presentation. Give me just a minute, please. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can. You're not in presentation mode yet.
Ok. Bom dia.
Well, our project. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here in this part of being part of the consortium. Dr. Vanya, you are not in presentation mode. Can you see it? Yes, we can continue that way. Thank you very much. Our project talks about formulation of microbial consortia for bioremediation of heavy oil contamination that affected the Brazilian coast. I'm having problems just to go through the slides. Just a minute, please. I'm sorry, give me just a couple of minutes. I'm going to try again. I'm sorry. Can you see my slide? Can you see my presentation? No. Yes, please share my presentation. Thank you very much. Just let me know when my presentation is ready so I can begin.
One moment, you should see it shortly.
Yes. Ok.
Does that look okay?
Tudo bem. Eu pensei que Karen ou Thaís iriam apresentar.
I thought that Karen or Thais was going to do the presentation, but I can see that I cannot go through the slides.
Can you see it now?
Não
Você
sei.
pode ver agora, professora, a tela?
Vamos ver se ela está conseguindo. Tá. Sim, acho que agora você consegue. Pode passar o slide, então, por favor.
Very well. Next slide, please. I think we're ready to begin. So our project on formulation of microbial consortia for the bioremediation of heavy oil contamination is coordinated by Lucimara Fazzarella Agnes Lima and myself, Vania Melo. The thematic areas covered by the project are the aspects of bioremediation and physical chemical remediation applied to heavy oils. This group works with ecosystems and affected. The objective, the general, is to develop formulations of microbial consortia that can be applied to bioremediation strategies by bioaugmentation. In mangroves, for example, coral reefs, estuaries, or to try to treat the waste collected. So our proposal is for the remediation in situ or ex situ. We have to isolate the microbials that we have already in our groups to formulate a consortia. We want to use, we have to isolate the oil. We have to do tests on the areas collected and the surfactants. We want to assess the degradation initially in ex situ in situ. Also, work with to assess the biosurfactants to monitor the products of that biodegradation, guaranteeing through tests of toxicity that we want to do. Next slide, please. Here we have a general vision of our project. We do treatments that can be done in biopiles or bioreactors. That would be ex situ or in situ in those ecosystems that were affected, where we cannot see the contamination, but we know that there are still contaminants, where we can do through biostimulation or bioaugmentation. In this strategy, we're going to apply this consortia with biosurfactants and nutrients in the mangroves, for example, and the need to immobilize chitosan beads and to apply bacterial consortia with or without atom biosurfactants. Here we can see a general image of our work where we do a collection of those oil samples in different states, in different areas. We collect the samples in beaches or in mangroves. These samples in the lab, they follow the strategies that we usually use. There are methods, normal methods. We do the extractions in order to have an idea of the microbial communities that are present in taxonomy and what they are doing in their functional processes. Next slide, please. Here we have a first result of our molecular analysis doing the sequencing, where we can see that the samples collected in 3 states in northeastern Alagoas, Ceará, and Rio Grande do Norte, they were contaminating the sand beaches of those states. They share a common composition, showing that the same oil arrived to the different environments that were contaminated. We can see that they share the same bacteria groups, and here we can see protobacteria that are commonly shown in oil spills, such as Alcaniborax, Vibrio, Allosospira, and this is due to the samples collected. And we also compared our taxonomic libraries with other libraries, which we can see oil spilled, and we can see it groups alone, separated by other samples, showing that the community associated to that oil that arrived to Brazil selected a very singular group of microorganisms. Here, we also compared our library with non-contaminated information in environments in reservoirs. And once again, the collection of microorganisms related to the oil is different in all the samples. This is important because we highlighted that the need to study deeply that composition to select what is present in that sample, which has a very singular characteristic, as our colleagues just said. We have composition inside the ocean. Next slide, please. We also worked with enrichment cultures. These cultures are done with the oil and then with a sample of that oil sterilized. We select the isolated, we build the consortia, and then we do the samples, the testings of compatibility, and then we just do the general analysis. Here, through chromatography, we already know the composition that was published by Brazilian colleagues, and we are able to assess really what is in this process of degradation. In parallel, we assess the biosurfactants production and applications. This has a very important role in mitigation because they are used as dispersants, surfactants. We already know that biosurfactants are as good as the synthetic surfactants, and they are biodegradable. And here we have some results with these microorganisms, dispersion of the spilled oil in the sea, and the cleaning of the beaches of the sand. We are working to develop these products to be used in case of new accidents. Next slide, please. We also have a bank. We also discovered a biosurfactant protein derived from the metagenomic library with activity in oil degradation because it's easier sometimes due to the conditions we don't have other possibilities available. So this is very interesting to us to solve the environmental processes that are ongoing. In order to really obtain that goal to formulate a product, we have the experience with the introduction of immobilized bacteria. This is biodegradable. This is the chitosan beads, and through residues of shrimp, we can obtain also through this chitosan through a biological process, and we can formulate these beads. We can create them, introduce these beads that degrade hydrocarbons and produce surfactants. We have designed strategies of remediation that can be adapted to these types of oil, an oil that is under the sea. So there are some technologies used as barriers or booms. These have been applied yet in the case of the oil spill in Brazil. So this is why we're trying to really develop a formulation that is compatible with this type of oil spill in Brazil. Just to wrap up, I would like to say that our group has students and works with startups because we think that we need innovation, technology transfer in order to do these processes, but we need partners in knowledge and transfer of knowledge, and this isn't always very easy to do. Next slide, please. These are my colleagues, part of the team for universities, three in the Northeast, one in the South, and we joined work and we expect to collaborate with our colleagues from NOAA, and they can share their experience. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry about the presentation. Thank you.
In an area I know very little about. So it was a lot of new and fascinating information for me, looking at microbial consortia being used for bioremediation of oil spills. And I also found the last section, the biosurfactant productions and the analysis of the bio augmentation strategies using using the chitosan beads, as you called them, very fascinating. So it shows for a lot of promise going forward. So thank you. For our next presentation, I would like to introduce Dr. B.J. John from Tulane University. He's going to give us a presentation on a molecular and nanoscale approach to oil spill remediation. And with that, I'm going to hand the floor over to Dr. John. Thank you.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Okay, terrific. It's a privilege to be able to participate in this workshop, and I want to try to talk about not so much the work potentially some of the challenges and some of the new areas in oil spill remediation. Dr. Mello gave an extremely nice background of bioremediation. At the outset, I just want to say that all the work that we've done has been funded by GOMRI, the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative. I work at Tulane University. I'm a chemical engineer. And we had this consortium called CMEDS, the Consortium for the Molecular Engineering of Dispersant System. And our whole objective was to try to understand what happens at the interface between oil and water when oil is out in the ocean, and then extend it to other aspects, as when oil is stranded, you have a liquid-solid interface, and if we can use fundamental concepts to be able to understand these processes better, and as a consequence, lead to better technology. A bit academic research, but longer range. Can we have the next slide, please? So here's the nature of the work that we've been doing for the past 8 to 9 years is a physicochemical understanding of the oil-water interface in the presence of dispersants. Since the Deepwater horizon was essentially something where dispersants were used, we focused all our efforts on understanding the concept of dispersants. Surfactants is a better way that we understand it. We want to extend this to an understanding of bacterial attachment and growth at the oil-water interface. Use this knowledge to develop new dispersant formulations and targeted delivery mechanisms that will address just the delivery of dispersants to the oil without wasting dispersants by letting it fall into the ocean. And finally, and most importantly, is the objective to train students and provide opportunities for education and outreach. Can I have the next slide, please? So when we talk about surfactants, whether it's synthetic surfactants or whether it's biosurfactants, what we need to understand is how these surfactants partition to the oil-water interface or to the oil-solid interface. How much surfactant is actually necessary? What happens to the excess surfactants? Do they form micelles or inverse micelles? And how is this tied up to the fate of oil and dispersant components? So I don't want to go through these figures in extreme detail, but I just want to point out a few things that we can learn from the thermodynamics of surfactants partitioning to the oil-water interface. It's often assumed that this is a reversible process, that out in the ocean that the surfactants can come off. And there's been some recent work, and that's really the little data on the extreme right that was done at Carnegie Mellon, that shows that it's not necessary for the surfactants to come off the oil-water interface. So there is a degree of irreversibility, and some of these synthetic surfactants used in Corexit and used in the Deepwater horizon may not entirely come off. So what is the downside of this? And can I have the next slide? The next slide shows basically an understanding of the oil-water interface, again, in the presence of surfactants. Okay, and what you're seeing there on the top left is basically oil with alkanivorax under it, and it forms this prolific biofilm. The biofilm helps sequester the organism at the oil-water interface, and it changes the properties of the the oil-water interface. It rigidifies the interface, and it makes it harder to form spherical droplets once you formed these biofilms. But understanding the biofilm is important. And what we say also, some of the findings, some of the original findings that we've had, is that surfactant at the oil-water interface, synthetic surfactants, may inhibit bacterial attachment. And on the other hand, we can use small particles, just like the chitosan beads that Professor Mello described, to sustain particle attachment at the oil-water interface. These are things called Pickering emulsions. And what you're seeing in the bottom right is basically just an illustration to show that if you have surfactant adsorbed at the oil-water interface, it inhibits attachment of alkanoborax. So the question becomes, what is the mode of oil consumption by bacteria? Is it through dissolved hydrocarbon? Is it through oil swollen micelles? Is it through oil solubilized in biosurfactant micelles? We don't know these answers quite yet, but these are areas to understand. So if we really get into the molecular and the nanoscale understanding of what happens at these interfaces, we might be able to develop new systems that could consume the oil faster, that could serve in remediation. Could I have the next slide, please? So based on, these are just 3 examples of some new technologies that have been developed, and all of this has been published. One is the concept of developing dispersants that look like gels, not like liquid formulations. These adhere to weathered oil. They don't come off very easily. They stick there, and the surfactants slowly tend to break up the oil. It increases the contact time with oil. It does not involve solvent use. They have high surfactant concentrations. And it increases the encounter rate with surface oil spills. So using gel formulations could be a way to improve the efficiency of dispersants. A discovery at the University of Maryland with whom we worked showed that you can use simple dispersants that are food-grade amphiphiles, completely benign. You don't have to formulate to extract surfactants, synthetic surfactants or biosurfactants. These are simple, environmentally benign surfactants such as lecithin and a polysaccharide such as twine, and they can serve as very efficient dispersants of the oil. The concept of using particles to that's on the right, using particles to stabilize interfaces. We design particles that have a synergistic effect with surfactants. So you can have both surfactants encapsulated in these particles. The surfactants reduce the interfacial tensions. The particles stabilize the interface. So you can keep droplets stable and suspended in the water column, and then allow the bacteria to consume the oil. So there are these new concepts. These are longer range academic type approaches that we hope will lead to better systems for environmental remediation of oil spills. And with that, I'll end, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. John. I found that that also a very fascinating presentation, especially looking at the new applications of dispersants, the gels, and the use of particles. I think there's a great opportunity here to improve the use of surfactants and dispersants. Also found it very interesting that and learned a lot more that I didn't know about the oil-water interface and just how important that is about the biofilm creation and how it can inhibit actually attachment by bacteria. I think those are important ideas, and certainly we need to understand what the fate of the bacteria is in terms of its ability to break down the oil in those conditions. So with that, that wraps up this particular session. I'm going to thank all the speakers for their time and for their presentations. If we get any questions coming in on the chat, we'll make sure we try to get those to you before Wednesday. And also, I will hand the floor back to Katie. She has a couple of announcements before we move on to the next session.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for your contribution so far today. I just wanted to share that we're going to go ahead and skip the break in order to stay on schedule. So with that, I am going to hand it over to our moderator for the next session, which is Joe Naughton from NOAA. Thank you, Joe. Over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Katie. And can I just confirm that you are able to hear me and everything?
Yes.
Yes, and you sound good. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you all. And thank you again. And hello, everyone. So as Katie said, my name is Joe Naughton, and I will be taking over for Terry as moderator for our next two thematic presenters. And before moving on, I also just want to thank our presenters from Group 1 and 2, as well as all of our participants for your continued patience as we work through the technology. Like Katie said, unfortunately, we had to take away the break, and we owe you all some extra coffee for that. But just want to reiterate, these have been really great and informative presentations on our end. We really look forward to these next two thematic areas. And so diving right in, our next thematic area is monitoring and assessment of effects of oil on ecosystems, organisms, and humans. And for our first presenter, we have Dr. Jose Malberte. Dr. Malberte is a professor at the Institute of Oceanography at the Universidade Federal de Rio Grande, an adjunct researcher at the Institute of Marine and Arctic Studies. And so I will hand it over to you, Dr. Malberte.
Hi, good morning. I don't know if you can hear or see me at the moment.
Yes, both great on my end. Thank you.
I had problems with my computer, so I switched to my cell phone, and I'm not used to this device. So I would ask Karen if she could project my presentation.
Sure. In a minute.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Well, while we wait for the presentation, let me see that I'm just going to go over a few points regarding monitoring and assessment, not only of oil, but of any perturbations on ecosystems, organisms, and humans. I'm stepping back from oil and try to make this a broader presentation so that we can be ready for any type of perturbation that may happen in a marine environment, and that we can use successfully monitoring strategies to cope with that. So as you all, could you go to next presentation, Karen? As you're all aware, ecosystems and organisms in the environment, they have their own variability, and they pulse according to different drivers and forcing, and they have a response to that, either at the ecosystem level or at the species level. So when we have a perturbation, let's say an oil spill, we're actually going above or beyond the thresholds that the ecosystem and the organisms are used to. That means that we have to have in place an understanding of the natural variability so that we can see how the ecosystem and the organism will be reacting regarding this perturbation. So next slide, please. So it is important, like when we have a perturbation, always there are a set of questions that arrive. Some of them were already referred to in the preliminary presentations. Where is the perturbation? Like, where is the oil spill? Where will it be over the next days? Will it remain here? Will it be advected away? Is the seafood around this perturbation safe? What are the impacts on the marine ecosystems? What are the species that are being impacted? how would another extreme event or a perturbation interact and react with that? Suppose you have an oil spill and then suddenly you have an extra a subtropical cyclone like we're facing up here today. This will change completely the wind patterns and bring in extreme conditions to that oil spill or to any other perturbation. So these are the sort of questions that we're facing. And here I have this just this figure from the questions that were asked with the big event of oil spill in the Northeast that Hoikiguchi gently sent it to me. And you see, these are the first things that we have to address. And next, please, Karen. So in order to address that, we have to have a timeline for the perturbation, and that timeline starts right before we actually have the perturbation. We need to have monitoring in place so that we can have a background, historical, a baseline information on the system, variability, its function, and in the services it provides. So that when the perturbation actually comes, we need to be able to recognize that event as an extreme event, as a perturbation. We need to assess its intensity, how much above the threshold it's going, what are its immediate effect. And we have to be ready with the monitoring strategy to follow up on the perturbation, to be able to evaluate the ability of this ecosystem to restore its variability, its function, and the service it provides to society. More than that, we really need to be able to forecast any new events, and we have to get from this exercise readiness for future perturbations. So once we learn that, what can we evolve and how can we face new perturbations? Next one, Karen, please. So in order to have a consistent monitoring and assessment of the ecosystems, organisms, and humans, we need to first answer a few questions. What are we going to monitor? We cannot monitor everything and measure everything in the ocean, so we have to have a more targeted monitoring scheme. And one thing that we can use the concept of essential ocean variables or ecosystem variables from GOOS, or the phenomena of interest. Let's say, what are the phenomena we are interested in? What is it going to affect? What drives it? What are the forces behind it? We need to be able to monitor in appropriate time scales. Do we require a monthly frequency? Do we require a seasonal frequency? Or during this stage, during the perturbation, will we need a more intense monitoring frequency so that we can probably assess better the effects of that? So, and also, where are we going to monitor? We need to evaluate the site location. We need to consider the ecosystem diversity and location perturbation. It's different to monitor in a mangrove. It's different from a coral reef, from a salt marsh, or for an open ocean. So these are all things that come in place when we define how we're going to monitor. So once we define, we decide on when, where, and define the what, we need to decide how to monitor. And for that, there are many best practices in place now that we can draw from. Another very important point in monitoring is not just monitoring, but we have to be able to share that data and information in a very consistent and operative way. We need to provide data for modelers so that they can assimilate the appropriate data and correct their models and validate their models. And we need to provide information for society. So we need to have good strategy for the society. Next slide. So what do we have currently in Brazil? We have many fragmented, not integrated, and not continuous monitoring system. Brazil has its own GOOS, its Global Ocean Observing System, which has many physical observing strategies. We've heard about the Pirata this morning, one open ocean monitoring, observing strategy for the ocean, but it's targeted on physical and climate information, although it has evolved to get more biological information. But we have also a Brazilian long-term ecological research monitoring program. And you probably hear that the importance of some of them in the northeast of Brazil to provide the benchmark and historical data for the oil spill we had in the northeast and how they are following up these consequences. We have a Brazilian coastal monitoring system that is slowly evolving. We have an ocean tracking network that's also established, but all of these observation systems, they are not integrated. So next slide. So what we need in terms of monitoring to be capable of establishing a well monitoring system? We need, first of all, an integrated sustained observation system. And this basically will have to coordinate the different players that already exist. And then they can take some strategies like, for example, the full strategy, the framework for ocean observation, to implement that. But mostly, any monitoring or observing system needs to be sustainable so that it can assure continuity over the perturbation time. So we can monitor the system as it evolves, as it goes along, so that we can have a proper information if it's restoring back to its normal, it's getting to a new stage, and how the system is responding. Maybe the US IUs can be an example, because you had this fragmented observation schemes in the United States, which under the umbrella of the US IUs and NOAA, it's a big player in that, integrated all this different information. As I mentioned, we need to have a good data infrastructure, and I think we have to base it on fair principles. And this data infrastructure can be used to create information products and a very well thought dissemination strategy, which will bring in products accessibly to the society. But most of all, this product and this data need to provide an early warning system, so that next time something happens, a perturbation happens, we'll have to be in place. We have much better preparedness for this event, and maybe this could be achieved with this INMAR, with the this new initiative of getting a Brazilian Marine Institute, which will be a great effort in that respect. So next slide, please. I stop here. So I'll leave these words that we can further discuss during this week. Thank you very much for all. Muito obrigado, and I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Moberte. With these next rounds of presentations, really starting to look at the more social perspective on the social sciences within oil response and restoration. And so I appreciate you kind of stressing the importance of monitoring and forecasting, as well as the need for data infrastructure and data sharing. So these are going to be really critical topics for this week's discussion. So thank you again for your presentation, and also covering the engagement with Goose. Just really great overview. So next, we'll move right on to our next presenter. We have Dr. Steve Murawski. Dr. Murawski is a professor at the University of South Florida, as well as serves as director and principal investigator for the Center of Ocean Mapping and Innovative Technologies. So over to you, Dr. Murawski. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I really appreciate the previous presentation by Dr. Moberte. What we're going to do is basically illustrate many of the principles that he brought out in his talk. And I think that's a really great starting point for looking at long-term monitoring. So my colleagues and I are academics or work for private research organizations. All of us have been funded by a consortium called the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative, which was a very large amount of money that BP put into understanding the impacts of Deepwater Horizon and science issues related to it. Next slide. So in terms of the overarching issues with respect to Deepwater Horizon, there are many. First of all, changes in the resource abundance and demography associated with deep water. What were the effects on various populations, ecosystems, et cetera. the issue of recovery times, and that raises the issue from what to what over what time frame. Obviously, different natural resources have much different responses to any kind of spill, and certainly oil spills. The pertinence of the concept of baselines, that is, how good is a baseline? Do you need to do it just once, or do you need to do it continuously? If you're trying to do attribution, that is, was the particular oil spill responsible for the population decline in a particular resource? Understanding what the contaminant baseline the day before the spill was is important. Contaminant concentrations, that is, before and after, and then the idea of having a control versus an impact area. This is a very important issue, and certainly one we struggled with Deepwater Horizon. More interestingly, one of the things that's really come out of our work on Deepwater is the rise of what we call sublethal individual population and community effects. Historically, oil spill research has primarily done things like looking at the LC50s, that is the lethal concentration at which 50% of an animal population would die. But we now know that sublethal effects can be as important, or, from the point of view of populations, maybe even more important. And so understanding that is been a real issue in terms of assessing Deepwater. Habitat effects, that is, it's one thing to talk about the effects on individual organisms or populations, but if you actually alter the productivity potential of the habitat, and we understood this better from several previous oil spills, like Exxon Valdez, that as you modify habitats, that actually may result in long-term issues in terms of recovery timeframes. The impacts of oil spill countermeasures themselves, that is the use of dispersing chemicals or water diversions in the case of Deepwater Horizon, other things. So it's not just the oil itself. And then the last issue I wanted to raise was the revelation of so-called black swans, that is, things we didn't know. And certainly Deepwater Horizon is replete with that. Next slide, please. So just as a schematic, Deepwater Horizon was a deep water blowout at 1,500 meters. The oil outwelled in terms of a underwater plume, but also came to the surface. And so you can see that, as the oil was transported to the coast, it affected not only the deep water ecosystem, but the pelagic water column, the offshore surface, the deep benthic through a process called MOFSA, which is basically oiled marine snow that was sedimented to the ocean. So, unlike what we all learned in high school, not all oil floats, and that's been a persistent problem for the benthos. And then, of course, the inshore impacts as well. Next slide. As I said before, one of the most important aspects, particularly of the Deepwater Horizon, has been to try to understand the impacts of oil spills from different points of view, as far as different levels of biological organization. So a lot of research has been done in the laboratories in terms of exposure studies, but also in the field. And so we have this sort of cascade of effects where we're looking at exposure through inhalation in the case of marine mammals, ingestion and absorption. We have these various different action mechanisms like DNA damage, et cetera. A lot of clinical indicators that we've looked for in field related sampling, organ and tissue effects, how does the oil and dispersant actually act on the animals, and organismal effects, which certainly lead to effects on populations. And then also, we really have to take account of all the co-stressors that are involved, and in particular, a lot more emphasis on things like the ultraviolet light and how that interacts with the contaminants in the field. Next slide. So as I said before, Deepwater Horizon, in terms of its impacts, actually affected 4 separate or connected ecosystems, and they include the deep ocean water column, the deep benthics, the continental shelf organisms, and the coastal and inshore. And so I'll just illustrate a few points from each of these. Next slide. So in terms of understanding the impacts on the deep benthics, a lot of sampling was done with multi-cores, as you see here. Next slide. And this is some summary work by Paul Montaigne and Patrick Schwing, looking at the myofauna and the macrofauna taken in some of the sampling. You can see that in general, the myofauna abundance went up. Species diversity went down, and this nematode copepod ratio, which is a metric used to understand the impacts of pollution, increased post Deepwater Horizon. Whereas the macrofauna, you can see in the wake of Deepwater, actually declined. One of the calculations that Paul Montaigne has made is that it may take from 50 to 100 years to actually sequester the Deepwater Horizon layer because of the slow accumulation of sediment deposition in the deep ocean. So it'll be with us for quite a while. Next slide. My colleague Tracy Sutton and his colleagues have been also looking at the biota that exist in terms of the mesopelagic fauna, the fauna that do the deal vertical migrations. And their research, mostly post Deepwater Horizon, has indicated a very large decrease in this entire community. And that's, this is based on sampling that's occurred over the last 11 years. And so, of course, one of the issues is, this sampling started in 2010 during the spill. And so, what is the baseline here in terms of the abundance? But it looks like the abundance has declined drastically. So trying to attribute this to Deepwater, of course, is difficult given the lack of substantial baseline. But if we're trying to sequester oil in the deep sea, it's going to affect a series of biota that actually end up getting to the surface anyway. Next slide. And some of our work on the continental shelves, this is all done post Deepwater Horizon. The oil spill itself occurred in the region in the north central part of the Gulf, but we're able to actually sample the entirety of the Gulf continental shelves, including Cuba and Mexico, to try to find the elusive location where we can use it as a control. One of the things we found, of course, is that with oil pollution, it's pretty much everywhere. And so this creates some issues, although we have been able to resolve the changes in the north central area as being primarily deep water. Next slide. And last, the nearshore, and this is a combination of graphics which look at the oil deposition on the shoreline relative to the oil on the water column using synthetic aperture radar. And you can see that there is a substantial intrusion of the oil into the nearshore area. Next slide. This graphic basically shows you 3 time periods. May 2010, before the oil spill happened, February 2011, after the oil had invaded the nearshore estuaries, and then in May of 2018. So what you see here is that the quantity of oil actually went up by at least 2 orders of magnitude, but it's only declined by 1 order of magnitude. And so again, in the nearshore, that oil will be there for quite some time. Next slide. There are a lot of impacts of the Deepwater Horizon spill in the nearshore. Oysters was just one of them. There's an open question about whether this was the effect of the oil or a lot of the water that was discharged out of the Mississippi River to try to push the oil away from the nearshore areas. But nevertheless, the context of this is there's been declining oyster populations in this region for decades. And so, you have to understand not only the specific impacts of the spill, but also the context in which they're being raised. Next slide. One of the most devastating series of impacts have been on the bottlenose dolphin populations occurring in some of the nearshore estuaries. And in terms of the northern Gulf of Mexico dolphin populations, we've seen symptoms like lung disease, impaired stress response, increased mortality, and this is very much in the long-term prognosis, very low reproductive success. And so that means that these populations are likely to be suffering from this oil spill for quite some time. Next slide. So last thing I wanted to focus on was the notion that was really expressed very well in the previous talk, and that is the vulnerability and the resilience of different species. And so as part of our work in synthesizing all these things, we've come up with a way to classify both the vulnerability of different animals to the Deepwater Horizon spill. So this primarily relates to these criteria on the left, which look at the intersection of, in particular, the Deepwater Horizon oil with the various life history stages of the species that we're looking at. And on the right, the resilience potential, and that's related to the underlying population dynamics of these species. And so it has to do with their abundance, their lifespan, their frequency of reproduction, et cetera. Next slide. So with a sampling of the various species that we looked at for Deepwater, you can see we've classified them into those 4 habitat types. And so we basically binned each of the species that we're looking at into whether they were highly vulnerable, sort of medium vulnerable, or low vulnerable to the particulars of the spill, and whether or not their resilience potential is low, medium, or high. So if you look at the upper left-hand corner, in the coastal nearshore, you see bottlenose dolphins, and actually 2 populations of bottlenose dolphins. They're highly vulnerable and they have low resilience. Whereas other species called Gulf menhaden, which is a small pelagic fish, had low vulnerability and high resilience. And so this gives us a framework where we can actually look at what we expect the recovery potential of animals oiled in the spill might be. Next slide. So I'll wrap up here pretty quickly. Obviously, fisheries are important. This graphic looks at a very long time series of fisheries landings and value data. You can see that the fisheries took a hit in 2010, but since then, overall, they've been quite resilient. Next slide. As far as conclusions, I won't go through the long list here. Suffice to say that some of these habitats were impacted more than others. Understanding these from the long time perspective that data, particularly monitoring data can give, are absolutely critical. We do feel that there are 2 pools of oil in the system, even 11 years after, and they will be creating issues for a very long time. Next slide. And that, we feel that we're in much better shape now to evaluate the impacts of spills, but not necessarily better prepared to mitigate these risks in the long term. And last slide. Well, okay, so let me just go one more slide. Okay, so why should Brazil and the United States cooperate on oil spill science? One of the really interesting things, of course, is the industry in the Gulf of Mexico is primarily extracting oil in what we would call the ultra deep. That's 1,500 meters or 5,000 meters deep. And there are 3 major basins where ultra deep resources exist and are being exploited: the Gulf of Mexico, off Brazil, and West Africa. And so if that's where our industries are headed, well, certainly, we have every reason to collaborate in terms of trying to understand some of these issues. So can you hit the button one more time? So this area is referred to by the oil industry as the Golden Triangle. It should be the Golden Triangle for research as well. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll send it back to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Morawski, for that great overview of the Deepwater Horizon and specifically the impacts to the Gulf of Mexico ecosystems and various co-stressors that must be addressed. I also appreciate your last point on the need for collaboration between our 2 countries, but also many others who are impacted by these issues. I know there's a lot of interest from the participants to discuss lessons learned from Deepwater, as many other experiences. So we look forward to hearing more throughout the week. So thank you again. Before we move on, I just want to remind everyone to please, if you have any questions, I know we are shorter for time than anticipated, but please to put them in the chat and we'll make sure to either send them to our presenters or address them later on in the week. So thank you very much. Again, moving on, our next presentation will be by Dr. Paul Sandifer, and I just want to confirm he is on the line. I know you were going to be in transit this morning.
Yes, I am on the line. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. So thank you very much. I can do a quick intro and hand it over to you. So Dr. Sandifer is the director of the Center for Coastal Environmental and Human Health at the College of Charleston in Charleston, South Carolina, as well as deputy director for the Center of Oceans and Human Health and Climate Change Interactions at the University of South Carolina. So thank you very much, Dr. Sandifer. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Colleague, Dr.
Paul, we are not able to hear you. I'm not sure if you're trying to speak right now. And Paul, we are still unable to hear you. I'm not sure if you're trying to connect, but I know Karen is sharing your slides and we are able to see those.
Joe, this is Missy Partika. I didn't know if you wanted me to jump in since we knew that this could be a problem.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for stepping in. You are more than welcome to provide the presentation. Thank you, Missy.
Okay, go ahead. So sorry, everyone. My name is Missy Partika. I'm a member of the Gulf Oil Spill Science Outreach Team, and I'm sorry that Paul's having some connectivity issues. He's in transit right now, and so we knew that this might be an issue. He did pass on his slide notes to me, so I'll do my best to cover his topic. Next slide, please. So this is a pretty complicated graphic we have right here, and I'm not going to go into minute detail about it, but essentially what we're showing here is the many different potential human impacts following large marine oil spills that range from the community level to the individual level, and they can have larger cultural impact or sociological impacts all the way down to psychological impacts of the individual. Essentially, what we're saying is that there are many deep, overlapping, complicated impacts when we talk about the impacts of oil on human communities and humans in general. Next slide, please. So here's just a comparison of some different publications that came out of the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative that Steve was talking about a little bit earlier. You can see that tiny little sliver on the top is essentially the types of human impacts, public health studies that have come out of GOMRI funding. And while that is a little sliver, it's just 3% of overall publications that came out of this broad initiative, and that might seem not very many. It's much larger than it was prior to Deepwater Horizon, which was about 1% of the literature that was out there associated with oil spill dealing with public health. So while there's been improvements, there's still quite a bit more to be said. Next slide, please. So the next few bullet points that Paul has listed on here are basically talking about some of the major findings that we have to date. We're going to talk more about this on Wednesday during breakout session 3, but just briefly going over them. We know that large oil spills can produce really broad-ranging mental and physical health effects on humans, but these can happen from direct exposure, but also indirect exposure. And those indirect exposures might actually have large contributing factors for mental health of different communities, but it can also be impacting socioeconomic status. So you might have job losses, but you see in this decrease in or an increase in anxiety along with job losses and impact to resources, we see this disproportionately with some of these communities that are heavily relying on natural resources. We do know that prior to Deepwater Horizon, that health studies were inadequate. They were inadequate even for those workers that we know are regularly exposed to oil chemicals during cleanup. That was even more inadequate, if that's even possible, for some of these other communities that maybe are having non-direct impacts, particularly mental health impacts. We know that lack of baseline data of socioeconomic impacts has made it really difficult to characterize some of these far-ranging, long-term impacts that we've seen in communities, because as we've heard from our colleagues earlier, without that baseline information, if you don't know what happened prior to the perturbation, prior to the oil spill, it's really hard to try to gauge what the impacts from that event actually were. We also know that there's a lot of secondary impacts or events that could be occurring at the same time, as our colleagues have already pointed out as well, that an oil spill doesn't necessarily happen in a bubble. So there might be a hurricane going on at the same time, or there might be a major red tide event that's happening, or some other big economic impact in the country, an economic downturn right at the time that there's a big spill going on. And all these things can have compounding effects on communities. We know that moving forward, that there needs to be more well-structured and funded human health services so that there's adequate data collection before, during, and after a spill, and that they can be compared then to some of the environmental impacts that are out there. But we also know one of the big problems that contributed to negative mental health impacts was insufficient communication with the broader public about what some of the impacts might have been. And part of this stemmed from the fact that the community wasn't brought in early on in the communication strategies. But there's a lot of misinformation out there. So when you're not providing people with information about potential risks and where the oil actually is, or how it could be impacting them and their families, then they will find the information somewhere. And sometimes they found the information in less reliable places. And so you have ever increasing anxiety, and we see false information come out, and that's really hard to start to claw that back and try to, redefine the narrative. Next slide, please. So we know moving forward into the future that there are still some major needs when it comes to human health studies following disasters, not just oil spills. We need to have some kind of implementation of continuous health and socioeconomic monitoring through a broader observing system that can help provide this essential baseline data that we've been talking about to not only assess the impacts of future spills, but see how those overlapping, interacting impacts are being felt throughout the communities. We need the ability to collect and analyze health, environmental, and socioeconomic data together to look at these, not just cause and effect relationships, but these overlapping linkages between oil spills, disasters, and health outcomes. There needs to be great enhancement in pre-event dialogues between the oil spill responders and the disaster preparedness community and the researchers that are actually looking at human health impacts in these communities and the communities themselves. Having this open dialogue early on, establishing this trusted type of relationship early on, ensures that there's stronger communication in those most stressful period of time during event. You need to have that trust established a priori if we're going to have open, trusting communication during the middle of an event. We also need improved toxicological profiles for a lot of the different chemicals associated with oil spills. We know right now that there is a relatively limited suite of chemicals that are actually actively tested for or monitored for following a spill. So while additional research is being done on what are some additional chemicals that should be tested for, right now there's not the good toxicological profiles to understand what's the level of this particular toxin that might exhibit a negative health outcome for a variety of individuals across age ranges and socioeconomic and underlying condition in those communities. We also know that we need to develop better human exposure and effects models to understand health risks assessment, again, incorporating underlying conditions. And I think that's something we can all appreciate right now, having gone through the last year of COVID, recognizing that sometimes underlying conditions can lead to much different health outcomes than might have been previously modeled. We also know that we need to increase research on the models of human health and socioeconomic effects that integrate them into oceanographic and ecosystem models. So it's not something that should just be looked at. The human element is over here by itself. It needs to be incorporated in some of the ways that we're looking at our ecosystem models that are existing right now. That right now are, a lot of money and attention and care, and I appreciate Steve's all his work that he's done. But if we start, looping in some of the human elements into those existing models, because we are all part of the ocean ecosystem. Next slide, please. And here, Paul's just assembled some publications that are existing right now, specific references looking at health effects. All of those papers contain extensive bibliographies with many additional references that are relevant to this work. And I know I went through this quickly, and Paul would have probably expounded much more gracefully on this topic. But if you have any questions, obviously chat them, and we welcome you joining us during breakout group 3 on Wednesday.
Well, thank you very much, Missy, for that great overview and for stepping in for Paul last minute. We really appreciate it. You provided a great summary on the health effects of oil spills and the challenges we face, particularly the lack of baseline health and socioeconomic data. I thought was interesting to address long-term impacts as well as the rise and dangers of misinformation. It's really important. And we're excited to hear more will be discussed on Wednesday, so really looking forward to the rest of the week. Thank you again. So next we'll transition to our fourth and final thematic area, which is the socioeconomic impacts, communication, and science dissemination, as well as citizen science. And first off, we have a presentation from Dr. Roy Kikuchi. Dr. Kikuchi is a professor in the Department of Oceanography at the Universidad Federal de Bahia. And so over to you. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Joe. Thank you for welcoming me, and thank you for the presence of everyone. So I just switched to Portuguese. I'll give my presentation in Portuguese, okay?
Is it up? Yes, we can see the presentation. Just change the presentation mode. I mean, I have done that already. Let me see. Is it working now? Yep, it is working. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and I'm going to talk about social economic impacts, communication, science dissemination, and citizen science. I'd like to thank all the people that have made the previous presentation because they gave us an overview of the problems that we have in oil spills. So we and have see also the problems that we have now because of the episode we had in 2019 in Brazil. So the idea of my presentation is to present the initiatives related to the oil spill that we implemented with the MCTI since we had the oil spill in 2019. And I want to be talking about the possibilities that we could have in the collaboration with NOAA around the social economic impacts studies. And just like Mitzi has shown before me, she showed before me, um, how can we integrate human and public health care to this model so that we can respond to these uh, to spills. So the aspects would be important would be response to plan this response. We also have to make a local regional impact assessment to understand the local vulnerabilities of the communities impacted by the oil spill. We also have to make a community vulnerability assessment and resilience assessment. And with this, we can come up with a risk assessment with the ecosystem models, oceanographic models, so that we can come up with mitigation planning and recovery programs with the best restoration of our environmental conditions. Besides that, for science outreach, I'm going to talk about some initiatives, some communication initiatives, and science outreach, and also citizen science projects. We have to tap into the experience NOAA has in this aspect, which is very broad. So what we know so far is that more than 5 tons of crude oil got to the shore, and we had the immediate impact that were measured when this got to the shore. That means that we have to improve our estimations, our assessment. There were severe economic impacts to traditional coastal populations. We have a study that published in 2020. There was a reduction of 80% on the marketing of seafood. We know that there's a likelihood of a public health impact on the people who helped clean the shore, clean the beaches, and also on the people who live off seafood and fish selling. We also have a mobilization capacity that responded to an emergency. There's a lot of collaboration, and the scientific community has the condition to be part of that mobilization and also come up with immediate and quick strategies for us to resolve as an emergency the problem. There is also willingness, public willingness from the population to help. However, we are not prepared for that, and that's why we need to train our response for similar problems that we may have in the future. We also know that there was oil return last year, and we find fragments or sparse new occurrences of oil in some regions of the coast. So there's some information on the internet about initiatives and institutions that are developing resources. There's this survey published with that was done with almost 2,000 questionnaires applied in 40 municipalities until October 2019, towards the end of the event, which had and we see there's a big impact on sales reduction and production reduction as well in terms of fish. So if we look at at hotel hotels and food industries were the most impact, and we see that around 60 to 70% of tourism and fishery companies had an impact. The same goes for hotels, but hotels were not as affected as the food industry. There was a socioeconomic vulnerability study published by a group that's part of our research network. With online data, Google Earth and Google My Maps were used to make this assessment. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the continuity of this study down the line. There were local studies on the impact on fishery, showing that the revenue was impacted. This was published not long ago, was this year, showing that the price or the sales actually for seafood and also like mollusks and crustaceans, fish, there was a reduction in sales and a loss in how many were sold, and the price went down too. So this had a severe impact on fishing communities. So what we need to know now, we have to look forward. What are the researches that we're doing? We have to quantify the extension magnitude of spills on the ecosystem. Just have a look about it, and many other colleagues have mentioned this actually this need. We have to determine what are the mid and long term impact on environmental quality, like water, sediments, organism ecosystems, on human beings, and on socioeconomic aspects.
Precisamos também acompanhar.
And we have to do a follow-up of the impacts in security and food security and security of the fishermen. So with all the collaborators, we are developing a regional study of a long-scale regional study, and there are about 48 points for data collections where we're going to analyze PAHs, fish, mollusks, and fishes. Also, will be analyzed level of contaminants in humans, specifically in these areas in the southern part where we have a very strong initiative in public health. In citizen science and citizen communication. And the ecosystems affected that were the estuaries, mangrove, beaches, and reefs. So one of the initiatives that we have, which considers citizen science, is this we called that's called mancha de sufrimiento, suffering stain. And we can see all the sites with the collaboration of the ecological programs of long-term projects in Alagoas. Already our friend showed us the localization in the map. Now we have a long-term tradition to collaborate with the environmental management, with this together with the communities. So there's an interaction, and this project that's led by Acioli seeks to do a bioregional mapping of the affected communities, considering aspects psychological, economical, and land effects, and also the human health. And the well-known by population of a lack of institutional support. So, especially this work is being developed and has been ongoing for 3 decades. You can see the installation of the conservation area. We have worked also with other conservation areas, and we have a long time tradition in these projects. Another second approach on the social economical impacts gave results. It's a research line, it's called Pact Futuro, proposed initially by the Universidad do Rio Grande do Norte, who has as main objective the assessment of the socio-economic impacts and adaptation processes of the fishing communities. I'm going to go back 2 slides because I forgot to mention the following. In this initiative that aims to understand the lessons learned and the attitudes and recommendations for response effects that the communities may have immediately once they have local access, immediate access towards these affected areas. Going back to the socio-economical impacts on the oil spill, the objectives are to identify and quantify the multiple impacts of the spill from 2019, estimate the adaptive capacity and resilience of the communities faced with future scenarios, and to include these problems in these systematic global images. So a third initiative is to continue with this first assessment done by the group in Serra. It's a socio-economical evaluation of the vulnerability and impacts, including in that first approach with online data or public data with the communities, because this project is for companies and with an assessment more focused towards the commercial initiatives. So in this case, we're going to include the fishing communities that are traditional and to do verifications in field to really check out these data. That would be online, and also data from the government and from commercial associations to assess all the models applied in this project. Also, I would like to mention that even though it's a topic on Group 3 that talks about human health, this is a very important initiative developed by the project of Professor Rita Franco y Amanda Northcross from the University of North Carolina, which is related to the fishermen and the population that worked in the recovery in the cleaning process of the coast during the event. The objective of this project is to identify the potential effects of oil spill to the health of laborers, volunteers, and fishing communities exposed to the oil. Also create a population baseline to monitor or medium long term of chronic effects of their health, and also of this event and other future events that may happen. Also to evaluate the actions of the health care services that civil society have available for them and for the protection of the population, and to produce technologies in health that the communities could use and they could have access to those technologies. Here I have an example of what is being done in cooperation among the university and consortium in Brazil on UNC that established a survey used, it's adapted of this questionnaire survey used in the Deepwater Horizon event. And we already have work field in execution with an assessment of a screening approach on the clinical health of the population. We are going to carry on with this assessment during a sampling process in analysis of samples on saliva and urine of that population affected by the spill. Talking about communication, outreach, work will be mentioned about the information dissemination on social networks. This is a study from the Belgian Costa dos Corais, Ceará, for the usage of Instagram, the news related to these hashtags, Northeast, oil spill, showing that there was huge dissemination of information during the second half part of this event. And then it entered in a situation, let's say, it entered to a level that we could not see where the information coming from that event. So it it tends to fall into forgetfulness. So we have to be really approach this more strongly. There's this initiative of mapping and monitoring that we began to do with the creation of Insight that brings more than 1,400 images that were taken during the volunteer initiatives of the groups that established that they established themselves through meetings or NGOs, volunteer groups, or people from the localities. They placed pictures with the localization data, with oil occurrences. We recovered part of those images and we're trying to recover all we can. We're doing a classification of these images according to the SCAT manual for the documentation of that oil spill. And at this moment, we want to transform this as a tool, as a monitoring tool in real time. And with this, the next step is to establish a collaboration with projects that will come and should have the similar initiatives as this one. There's another initiative in community science and participation science we're developing with Luchek that is already being done in Tamandaré more than 10 years ago. We're going to at least establish another model on site, and all those sites we have to continue with these types of activities. Our INCT has a web page which we want it to be like the core of the information. We want to synthesize everything on this oil spill of 2019. There are several initiatives, several web pages in Instagram, and a lab, LACOS 21, from the Alagoas University, and a YouTube channel where they communicate recently, like it's called a cartoon called Maravista, talking about the oil spills. This is oriented for children. There's also a campaign called Criança com Ciência, children with science. So we want to maintain these channels, and we want to open this information on this event. We cannot forget this event, and we want nobody to forget this event. This is why we want to work in these aspects as a preparation for to prevent future spills. Our campaigns, we have folders to show the work we are doing, what is the data collecting, the samples we're doing, and also information, what is important to know, suggestions, initiatives, and collaboration with the communities. I would also like to remind that in this project, in the assessment of impact of the oil, large part of the samples and our organisms that are being done in situ are also done with the community, participating and indicating the areas that should be sampled. Very well, I would just like to show the last slide. There, I would like to thank all our collaborators and this research network that was formed from this accident on, so we can access this, assess and access this impact. And large part of the participants is in this workshop today. So I would like to thank them all, and I think we're all going to find very important paths to keep on going in this process. Thank you very much.
For your presentation and also the great overview of socioeconomic impacts you provided, but especially as it relates to kind of the different sectors and regions, but also keeping in mind mid versus long-term restoration strategies in this need for adaptive capacity, as you had talked about. And also your discussion on participatory mapping and monitoring the need for citizen science. Overall, it's really great and robust presentation, so thank you. Next, we'll move right on to our next presenter, Dr. Ademilson Zamboni. Dr. Zamboni is the General Director at Oceana and will be providing a presentation on fishing communities and the impact of oil and COVID-19. So thank you, and over to you.
Bom dia a todos. Hello, everybody. Em nome da aliança composta
with the organization and Oceana, I would like to thank the Ministry of Science and Technology and NOAA for this invitation. I'm going to share my presentation.
Okay. So.
Okay. These organizations are present in Brazil, supported here by a Brazilian foundation who has been dedicating to understanding the vulnerability of these tertiary communities that were impacted by the spill and then by COVID-19. So this has led to many socioeconomic.
Como o Dr. Kikuchi já levantou há pouco. Além disso, a gente está buscando com essa aliança, pequena aliança que nós criamos, ampliar a divulgação dos dados e as informações que foram geradas, na mesma linha que o nosso apresentador que me antecedeu mostrou, mas numa outra ótica também, mais focada no ponto de vista da atuação das organizações não governamentais e sua participação nos territórios afetados. Enfim, a nossa missão aqui é ampliar o espaço de interação de ciência com a sociedade e, concordando com o Dr. Kikuchi, não deixar com que essa história pare por aqui, que essa história morra, né? Então, criamos um pequeno trabalho, um pequeno grupo, com o objetivo de mapear essas.
The factors that lead to the risk, the community, fishing community and its capacity of reaction, and the initiatives that are happening during part highly recorded, and also access towards the society to understand what is being studied in contamination. And here we can see a huge example. And now through YouTube, who are accessing this presentation, there's a platform that makes available this information that's accessible for the society and can, for example, it's counteraction measures for the scientists in general, not only for those who are for a long time working on these aspects, but are together working with the communities in Pernambuco, Bahia, Alagoas, and give the communities data that can help them to react whenever needed. And finally, the mission of our organization is to influence public policies on vulnerability of the community. So the first axis that I called vulnerability and resilience, we try to define a methodology. It's a little bit different with respect to what's happening, is to apply in this territory all what we know. So we based on.
Que era o mais óbvio, né?
Which was to expand and understand the exposure to oil based on the reach of the oil as the testimony of people. So we're trying to focus on information about the municipalities. With COVID-19, we started talking about actually the number of infections per capita. So there's an indicator here of how this has been combined and shows some gaps in the information that should be available, but that are not available. For example, so there should be easy to find. So we moved to listening to the community to see the perception they have about these 2 points. So there were many interviews, 29 interviews with leaders, uh, like fishing leaders, members of the civil society, and also 2 seminars, virtual seminars with 60 people to present the results and collect more suggestions and ideas about what they think we could react, how they think we could react in the future. And then the data starts getting interesting because at first we had a cold data, let's say, like where we had I don't know 12 hotspots for vulnerability, when we start listening to people to know about their perception, this changes a lot. And then there are new places that are included. There's another interesting data because not necessarily a place that received a lot of oil or was impacted by the spill was considered to be highly vulnerable. To the contrary, some municipalities that were considered to be vulnerable had no interaction with the spill or very small interaction with the spill. So, what is vulnerability? What is what we call socioeconomic and environmental and vulnerability? It has to do with income, food security, social organizations, the presence of leaders, access to decision makers, which is really important in this community to have a knowledge base. So this happens when we want to help. We play an important role because we are present in many coastal communities. We are close to some relevant communities, and we also have a budget that allows us to help absorb this information and pass it on to society. By listening to the people, it was the first time that we were told and shown how these communities value the role of academia and scientists in increasing their resilience. For them, it is valuable to have partnerships with universities and projects that support their organization and the management of fishery and spill impact. So this knowledge has to be shared, and this also applies to NGOs, even though they are outsiders. They have tried to make the bridge between the science and society. The second axis, which is more evolved when it comes to scientific communication, we made efforts to recover all the data available about contamination of fish and environment. Dr. Kifushi has already shown, and also all the records and where this data is. And this is pure science for this topic. And also talk about the sources, uh, where we're going to be getting data from, especially about funding. How much is Brazil willing to fund so that we can understand the impact that this coast has had with the spill and that we may have again down the line? To do that, we started actually focusing on four sources: Elsevier Scopus, Springer, Science Direct, and Cielo. And then we looked into publications between 2019 and March 2021, looking into 27 articles on topics about resilience or related to resilience and vulnerability. We came up with a report that's going to be available to everybody with a detailed description. So we see, considering these three or five points, it is we see that 64% were around characterizing the spill, because everybody actually tried to describe the spill. And number two are the social economic impacts that we knew about. There's a second work stream, which is to map the initiatives in place so that civil society can keep track of this information and make sure this makes it to society. We're talking about the public resources, well, so this is public data and knowledge that could serve most people to make a transformation in their life. So we have a secondary data about where this research was made, and we have contact or direct contact with scientists. So we crossed the information with all the information from this database. Then we surveyed 61 researchers with 18 questions. 20 people replied. This we did together with Dr. Karin Copy and Dr. Magalhães. So we can then access the information about what are the organism groups that are monitored and assessed, and about the research topics and the universities that actually conduct these research. And why are we doing this? Basically, this is a need that we have to communicate. So that's why we have aligned with the effort that Dr. Kikuchi talked about of communicating in a way that people can understand and have access to scientific knowledge, especially in fishing communities. Even though I know that many of the people that are watching us today, they already do this, they work closely with these communities. This is still a topic that we have to work hard on in Brazil. Maybe in the near future, we're going to be more present in this discussion. So we are organizing our website. We're creating a website that can be used by institutions, by groups to cover these these themes, showing not only the contamination, but to be a space where we have testimonies from fisher people, scientists, leaders, op- opinion leaders. The idea is to have a platform for the press, for researchers to have access to quality information produced by researchers. We want to show the policies to increase the resilience to spills, and we're not safe today. I mean, after 2 years, we should be more prepared to any other spill that we may have down the line. I honestly am not sure about it, so it's a connection space, and I invite you all to engage and use the content that we're going to put together. It might be different from what you are producing. So this is a call to action. And why is it possible and desirable? Because I mean, first of all, if you consider the fishermen, they recognize the value of science, but they want to have interaction with some feedback. So science should be translated into tools for their daily demands and activities. So we have to create in community some kind of have to build capacity so that we can reduce their vulnerability. We have to see how we can broaden or have more pressure on decision makers for changing. So I want to talk now about a study that you probably know, which is the public perception about science and technology. This was done by CGEE together with the ministry. This is the 2019 edition, but we've been doing this since 2010 and have interesting information. And I highlighted 5 points. The first one is that the interest in science persists in society in Brazil, and Brazilians trust the science and scientists, but we still have very little access to science knowledge. So I have two more pieces of information here, and the first one is how much do they trust scientists from public universities and research institutes? This is compared only to the trust that the Brazilian citizens have in physicians. However, mostly people say they can understand the science knowledge if it's well explained. 82% agree of people agree with this statement. So that's why we have to customize our knowledge to simpler language, to have more scientists to communicate what you study, and this has to get to people. And we can contribute as NGOs because this is part of our daily activities, especially when it comes to communication, advocacy, and mobilization. And I want to leave one more reflection about how we can address a discussion that the ministry has tried to drive about citizen science that Dr. Kikuchi also talked about. So I wanted to talk, I want to talk about the challenges in such a difficult situation. What comes first, citizen science, the way it is now? Like citizens bring me database for me to work on so that I can give something back one day to you. Or science for citizens because they have urgent demands. They live in precarious conditions in terms of access to information. I also recommend this article, Science or Citizen Science Beyond Data Collection. And this is the way that I wrap it up. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Dr. Zamboni, for your very comprehensive presentation on citizen science engagement, as well as your call to action to really translate science into tools and instruments appropriate to both meet the needs of the local communities, but also to continue to inspire and engage local knowledge around these kind of issues. So thank you very much for that. Very informative. And for last, I guess we'll move right into our final presentation for today. And I would like to introduce Dr. Sean Rowe. Dr. Rowe is a professor and marine education learning specialist at Oregon State University and will be providing a presentation on public trust in science of engaged practices. So thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me fine.
Yep, I can confirm.
I think I'll be echoing some of what the last two speakers mentioned because I'm going to talk about public trust in science and engaged science, community engaged research in particular, and with a focus on citizen science and outreach. I work for Oregon Sea Grant, which is part of the NOAA Sea Grant program. And what makes Sea Grant different from a lot of the rest of NOAA is our focus, explicit focus on education and outreach for public audiences related to the science that NOAA scientists and university scientists do in the marine and coastal environment. I also work with partners and colleagues at the National Institute for Science, Study of Science and Technology, Communication of Public Science and Technology at Fiocruz. And our work there spans both the presentation of science in museums and in public kind of forums, as well as thinking about other ways of engaging publics more deeply than simply providing information. Can you, next slide, please? I want to start with the public trust, and Dr. Zamboni just had some very similar and interesting statistics as well that go along with what I've got here. In the US today, in the 2020, 77% of Americans say they have some or a lot of trust in scientists to do what's right for the public. In 2020, in an international published study, 59% of Brazilians said the same. This is a little different from say they understand the science. This is literally what's the trust in scientists at large to do what's right for the public. In the US, as we've tried to break this down and understand it a little bit more, we see that it's different according to what kind of science you're talking about. So if you're talking about medical sciences, for instance, the number is really high. 80% of Americans think that medical scientists are trustworthy and are doing what's right for the public. When it comes to environmental research scientists, so the kinds of geoscience that we've been talking about here, the environmental sciences we've been talking about here, that number drops to 57%. So only 57%, just over half of Americans have an overall positive view of environmental research scientists. And this is typical in science communication, that when you get to specific sciences, especially sciences that might be considered problematic or controversial, like climate change science, the number drops from this high trust, this high understanding, this high belief in the transparency of the science to lower numbers. And while 57% is still pretty good, these numbers have remained steady since the 1970s. So overall, there's a general trust in science in the US and in Brazil. But when you get to specific issues where there might be considered conflicts of interest or where disasters happen and there's a need to communicate directly with communities, the numbers do change and need to be taken into account. You can go to the next slide. The sort of solution to this, and I think I heard it in the last two slides and in other slides this morning, is this notion of community engaged research. This sense that without a real explicit understanding of how to work with communities, not on communities or do research to communities, but do it with communities, the beneficial relationships that accrue from research don't accrue equally. We need these mutually beneficial relationships between communities of individuals and communities of practice and science in order for both to benefit from doing research in environmental context in particular. And I want to talk about just focus briefly, and I'll keep it short, on kind of the two of the strategies typical strategies in the kind of environmental monitoring work that we've been talking about today for doing this kind of engaged work. Next slide, please. And the first is, of course, citizen science. Science for citizens or citizen science. And citizen science is valuable among environmental sciences and long-term ecological monitoring research because it fulfills a series of needs. It creates baseline data, and we've heard the notion several times today of the need for baseline data or the absence of baseline data, not simply in the ocean context or for marine species, but maybe especially in the human context and the social and cultural context surrounding the use of marine environments. It also fulfills the needs of long-term ecological monitoring. monitoring that can be done by remote sensing, monitoring that can be done by modeling, monitoring that can be done by satellite, all are important, but the need still exists to ground truth data and to collect data at local scales often where remote sensing is not possible or practical. In the US, we can't send graduate students out to all the sites where we need data from. Citizen scientists, people working in communities with scientists, becomes one really important way of collecting that long-term data and baseline data. A third need that when you have a robust citizen science network that's fulfilled is the need for trained volunteers and local communication networks. So if you have a 20-year-old citizen science program, for instance, in a region, it's not simply a way of providing data for research. It also becomes a funnel and a conduit for information going back out to communities. The community members who are involved in the science are often trusted community members. They're trusted neighbors. They're often local experts. They may be considered to be elders in a community or important people in the community. And we know that community members trust what they hear from each other even more than they trust what they hear from scientists and the media and the government. So this citizen science networks work in both directions, both to provide data and enrich the science, but also to provide outreach and education and enrich that through local, assessing local needs and making things speak to local communities. And a fourth is transparency of methods. So this Pew study that I mentioned earlier, one of the nuanced details that comes out of that research is that the more people feel they understand the methods of a particular science, the more they trust in that science and the scientists that do it. Citizen science is an excellent way to create this sort of transparency of methods, to have a type of authenticity of what the science looks like, so that it's easier for people to understand this is what you do in your work, this is how this work progresses, and this is how I can be involved in it. I now understand something better about how the data is collected, even how data is analyzed, or the trajectories of data in terms of decision making and policy. These are really important outcomes from public participation that we often overlook because we're focused more on the quality of the data. I will mention here, though, that quality of data and rigor of data is really the key to successful citizen science going in both directions, both in terms of supporting the research long term, but also supporting communities in understanding and engaging with research. Can I see the next slide, please? This is one example of that kind of extended long-term network internationally. Sea Grant Alaska is involved with this. You can see a lot of the groups that are involved with this. This is the Atlas of Community and Indigenous-Based Monitoring for Circumpolar Region. So the entire Arctic region. People are collecting data in communities, at community levels, often through indigenous communities, and often in close connection with scientists working in universities or agencies or NGOs around the world. If it weren't for these communities collecting data, there would not be data in many of these places. And it's not simply the ecological data and environmental data that these groups collect and make available for scientific research. The health and wellness measures that we've been talking about in the last two speakers are also hard to assess and hard to get any other way than through community-based efforts. So this is a great example of a really robust network of community-based, participatory scientific data collection, even analysis and decision-making. See the next slide, please. Regional networks really become an important component of any kind of science outreach, especially when you're talking about disasters and disaster recovery and understanding the mid to long-term impacts of disasters. And so I borrowed this information and slides from Steve Sempier, who works with the Sea Grant in the Gulf of Mexico, the regional network there, and the Oil Spill Science